Hello, everyone. Welcome to Influitive Live, and I'm thrilled to be here with David Spinks, the founder of CMX and the Vice President of Community for Bevy. This is a feature presentation on the state of communities. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'd love to get right into it, but maybe first tell us a little bit about yourself and CMX and how CMX fits into Bevy.
Sure. So CMX started it 6 years ago as basically what I wish I had when I first started working in this industry. So I started building community for companies, 11 years ago now. And when I started, there just weren't any resources really to teach you how to do this work. It was a pretty new nascent industry. And so most of what I learned, I had to just kind of learn through trial and error. And eventually led to starting CMX 6 years ago. It started as a conference, CMX Summit, and developed into a large network. We have about 20,000 members across our network now, and publish research, training programs, and host events in 60 chapters around the world. On top of our annual conference, just trying to give community teams everything they need to be successful. And we were acquired by Bevy about 1.5 years ago. Bevy is a software product that powers community programs for lots of great companies. Essentially, if you have local events and you have members of your community who want to run local chapters around the world, this is a tool that will give them everything they need to run their local events, manage their own local communities, but you as an organization get a centralized platform to keep everything consistent across your community, across all these chapters around the world, and get all the data back in one place so you know who's coming to your events and what events they're going to. And so, now we kind of just work together with the same mission of helping community teams thrive. Bevy is the software arm, and CMX is the community and content arm.
Awesome. So they will be powering your CMX 2020 event in October.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, all CMX events are run on Bevy, and our CMX Connect program is all powered by Bevy as well, which is where we have all volunteer run local chapters in over 60 cities around the world.
So communities have been around for a long, long time. Where do community managers, leaders come from? What walks of profession or life do they come from? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, usually not business. Most community professionals come from education, from PR, from nonprofits, from usually very human-centric work, and then they realize, oh wow, there's a great opportunity to build community for businesses as well, and they kind of find themselves in these roles, which speaks to some of the challenges I think a lot of community professionals have, because they come from a very human-centric mindset. And then they're working in a business, which is, a very different kind of context. And how do you tie the human stuff, the community stuff back to business goals? And so that's kind of the learning curve that a lot of community professionals go through, because they're very natural, people. They're very organically good at, gathering people and building community. But then how do you do that in the business context, tie it back to business goals and business operations? That's kind of the learning curve for a lot of them.
I would think that if that's their area of expertise, that they could also marshal resources and get other members of their organization to be part of those communities versus them doing it themselves, right?
Yeah, that's spot on. A lot of the advice I often give is like, think about your executives like they're a community. So if you're building a community of your executives, what would you do?
Yeah.
You would want to get them involved really early in the process. You'd want to make sure their voices are heard. You want to kind of get them to be talking to each other and feel excited about what you're doing with community. So all the same things that you would do to build a community of customers or anyone else, you could think about that internally with stakeholders as well.
So we're living in an upside down world, very much so, with so much going on. How has that changed the world of communities?
Yeah, we are in kind of global reckoning with community, I think. There's kind of 3 massive trends that are happening all right now to create sort of like perfect storm of sorts. We have the coronavirus and all of us being on lockdown and realizing that being able to gather in person was actually really, really important. But it was a status quo before, so we didn't really notice it, or we kind of took it for granted, kind of like breathing. You don't notice that you're breathing until you're underwater and you can't breathe, and all of a sudden it's the most important thing in the world. Same kind of things happening right now with being able to see your friends and family and gathering with people in person. We kind of took it for granted because it was always there. Now that it's not there, we realize just how important that human contact is. And so we're seeing all these new virtual tools come and try to fill that hole. We see where that's falling short, but there's also a lot of really interesting innovation that's happening right now because of the situation we're in. People are getting really creative with building tools that innovate beyond this like standard Zoom format. And then we have the kind of like fever pitch of social media platforms just like feeling extremely toxic and divisive these days. And I think people are getting exhausted by that. You can't go onto social media without seeing a lot of negativity, and just be reminded that this is a space that no one's really moderating or taking care of or investing in the culture. The people who built Facebook and Twitter have always taken the stance that like this is an open platform. We're not going to try to facilitate the culture. And so people are starting to seek more independent, more moderated, more curated community spaces. And then we're seeing the Black Lives Movement and our global reckoning with race and facing our history of oppression and exploitation, and seeing how that isn't just part of history, and it wasn't just outright racism that's the problem. It's a system, it's an institution that's built into everything, especially in the US, but it's a global problem. And so we're seeing as community builders and in our communities, how are we responsible for perpetuating that standard? And what can we do to move things in the right direction and take an active role in being anti-racist in how we build communities and making sure we're building inclusive spaces. So those three things are like the move to virtual community, and that awareness of lacking in-person community, the growing kind of exhaustion with big social media platforms, and then our reckoning with race is kind of forcing us to rethink everything we've thought about community in our generation. And I don't think community is ever going to be the same after 2020.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. So for organizations that have communities, and with all of this change going on, is it even more important to have curation of your communities?
Yeah, I mean, and like you have to be careful with curation because you don't want it to be elitism, and you want to make sure exclusivity doesn't mean you're excluding people based on race or privilege. But community is always about curation. Community is always about saying like, this is who we are and what we believe, and we're creating a safe space for those people, which means being specific about who this is for and who it's not for. And so I think, yeah, I mean, curation has always been really important for community. And I think there's an extra large opportunity right now for, if you're a business or anyone who's building community, to create a space that is, not necessarily on a big social media platform, and say like, if you want community, but you want it to be more intentional and focused, we're creating a space for this kind of person, which can align with like your customer, the audience that you're trying to reach, but really creating that sense of shared identity, and bringing in the right people that align with that identity will make your space feel a lot more compelling than really broad, uncurated spaces.
What would be realistic for an organization that doesn't have a community today to spin one up? And as far as timing of what are the success metrics? How long does it take to get a thriving community going? Is it months, years? What's proper?
I mean, all communities are going to go through, what's called the community life cycle. So I kind of describe it. I mean, there's lots of ways of describing the life cycle. I describe it as like almost like a tree. You have your seed stage, where you just plant the seed and it starts to grow into a seedling. You have the growth stage, you have maturity, and then you have pollination, where it kind of spreads and becomes a forest. And so it's kind of in that way. you can build, the foundation of community in one day, in one event. But community is about repetitive connections and creating ongoing opportunities for people to gather and share experiences. So you can start today and already have the foundations and an experience of a community. You organize a great dinner, the people in that dinner are going to feel a sense of connection and community. But it's about the repeated ongoing facilitation of that. So are you bringing those people together again? Are you creating an online space for them to talk to each other 24/7? Do you do a big gathering once a year? And over time, as more and more people continue to engage in that space, the community as a whole will move into, more of a growth stage. So it's starting to like organically grow and people are just engaging in it online or offline very organically without you needing to over facilitate everything. Eventually you'll reach a maturity stage where there's like very established norms and rules. And then the pollination stage is like, okay, it's so mature that people want that unique identity, right? They want something more curated because it's too big and broad now. And so they'll either split out and create a new community, or they build subgroups within that community, like Reddit breaking down into subreddits. And there's no like one answer for how long that will take, but like, I don't think you can expect a community to reach maturity in any less than 12 months. Probably more like 2 to 5 years for a community to really be mature.
Generally speaking, does the executive office have that understanding of that time span and the patience for that, or are they starting to warm up to it, knowing the importance of community now that we're living in this global pandemic and people are human, they want to be connected and they can't be physically?
It's a great question. I think some get it, some don't. More are getting it. I think like historically businesses would do, field marketing and they would look at it as like, these are a bunch of independent events that each, we expect some direct outcome, but they didn't look at all those events collectively as a set of experiences that are building a community. And the closest they would get is kind of calling it a brand. And a brand is essentially a shared identity. A brand is a community identity. And so it's like, that's probably a better way of framing it for an executive is saying like, instead of looking at it like advertising of, we're going to like put out this message, get immediate data back and see results. Think about it more like building a brand that like, well, how long would it take you to build a really strong brand? Mm-hmm. Not a day. It's going to take you years to really establish it. You can build the foundations now and you can start to see results, but it's going to take time. And so, I don't want that to be misleading to say that you can't get results from community very quickly. I think you can spin up a community, especially if you have a lot of trust and a very engaged audience. You can spin up and start scaling community quite quickly, actually. So you can have multiple chapters going in a few months, or you can have, really good conversations going in just a few months. And you can already start to see new leads and prospects coming in, or customers, their customer experience improving. You can see those kinds of results really quickly, but to actually establish a true community, and it kind of is like an exponential curve. Like you'll start to see some value, but then as your community becomes more established, that value is actually going to like exponentially increase over the years.
Well, it sounds like it takes a village. It's not just one department that builds a community. So with the world with companies being digitally transformed, you had talked about event marketing is contributing to communities. I'm not sure every department thinks about it that way, but they probably need to be working collaboratively for the greater good of the overall community that they're trying to build.
Absolutely. I mean, a business is a community. Like It is. And for some reason, we don't think of it that way. We think of it, I mean, like historically, we've thought of companies as like a machine. And you try to build your well-oiled machine, and it turns out a great product that consumers consume, and it's this trade that you have with them, and then maybe you ask them for feedback and you improve your product. But in reality, a business is a community. So what is a community? It's a shared identity, shared purpose, a group of people who feel connected to each other, who are working together to achieve a shared goal. All these things are things that describe a company. and it's essentially like, think of it as like an ecosystem of like concentric circles. So at the core, you have your team and your employees, and then you have ambassadors, and then you have like your customers, or even your like power users, and then you have people who just follow you, and maybe they're just aware of you. Um, and so like as you move out, people may be less engaged with that shared identity or less committed to it right now, but it's all part of one continuum. It's one spectrum of a community. And so if you actually think about your business as a community, everyone's job on your team is to build that community, right? So your marketing is like creating that brand and that shared identity, and creating the messaging. Your product team is building tools and software that's solving problems for that community. Your support is answering questions and solving kind of the specific tactical problems that your community is having. And the community team's job is to facilitate connections, right? The community team is connecting the customers, or connecting the employees, or connecting the power users, connecting the ambassadors to each other to deepen that sense of community and facilitate, more contribution from that community. So everyone's job is to essentially build a healthy, engaged, growing community. The community team's job is to just facilitate those interactions.
So you touched on a few different use cases there of communities. So as you know, Influitive is all about creating advocate communities, but we also mobilize our advocates to support other communities within their own organization. It might be a support community to help reduce support tickets and peer-to-peer education and training. Are there certain use cases of communities that you find more successful than others?
I wouldn't say more successful than others. So we break it down using something called the Spaces model, which covers kind of like all the 6 different areas that community drives impact for a business. So Spaces stands for support. So support forums, answering questions for each other. Product is collecting feedback and insights that help you improve your offering. Acquisition is you're attracting new customers and driving pipeline. Growing awareness through community programs. Contribution is essentially like user-generated content. So your community members are contributing the content that makes up a platform or a product. Engagement, which is customer experience and retention. And then success. So how are you making your customers more successful at using a product and more successful in their career? And so there are community programs that can drive all 6 of those. Are some of them more successful than others? Not necessarily, but I think one thing that I'm a big advocate for is to stop thinking of community as a cost center or solely as a cost center, and start looking at it as a growth engine. Historically, the last 10 years, for the most part, except for like the last year or two, community was seen more as a cost center. As like, all right, we're going to invest this money. We're not going to expect necessarily a return, but we need to like provide a support forum, or just have this space that people can answer questions for each other. It'll reduce our support costs, and so that's how we'll justify the investment. And I think that's a very limited scope of community. I think like where there's a ton of opportunity and where community teams are going to get a lot more budget and buy-in, and where you're going to get the CMO really excited about what's happening, is you look at it as a growth engine. How is community bringing in new voices? How is it growing awareness of your brand? How is it driving trackable leads and prospects, right? Like I was just talking to Mary Thangvall, who's an amazing author in the developer relations space, and she uses a term called community qualified leads. So same way you have sales qualified leads or marketing qualified leads, why not have community qualified leads? Which essentially means that if people engage in and participate in our community, that's a way of qualifying that they are a better fit for our sales team to follow up with, and a good fit for our product. And then customer retention as well, right? Community is an extremely powerful tool for making your customers more happy, driving that customer success, teaching them and educating them, investing in them more than just giving them a product, but trying to make them successful as a person and successful as a professional. That's going to grow a business's bottom line and we're seeing it grow the bottom line in pretty extreme ways. is driving millions and millions of dollars in ARR for companies who are investing in community with that kind of growth engine mindset. So that's where I would urge you to not just look at it as a support forum, which is one element of it and one output of it, which is valuable. It's super valuable. I don't want to discount that, but that's like a limited scope. How do you look at it as literally something that impacts every part of the business, especially the things that will drive growth?
Well, every company needs a growth engine. And if you say that every business is a community, is there a certain size company you have to be before you start developing your community?
No. You can start on day one. I mean, if you think about it, like a company can't start without building a community, because how does any startup start? It's a founder with a wild idea, and she will then convince other people that they should pay attention to that idea, even though it's just a out there idea. The product doesn't work yet, it's buggy, it's in beta, and you're trying to convince people to use it, and you're trying to convince people to work for you. Why are they going to do that? It's because you built a relationship with them and you built trust. And you probably like organized a space to start bringing people together, or you hosted a dinner or an event to start talking to people. You're networking yourself. So community is the foundation of how businesses start. And what happens though is that companies lose that over time, because the CEO can no longer build relationships with each person individually, and they don't think about it as a community. So they don't look at how do we build relationships at scale by connecting people to each other. And so I think you should start from day one. And the key, and what community teams are really good at, and why you should hire a community professional early on, is they can scale relationships. So it's not all one-to-one, it's many-to-many. Yeah.
So where's the balance of a community leader that starts a community, and when is the time for them to get out of the way and let the community interact with each other versus trying to be proactive to spur action inside a community hub?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, going into that kind of community life cycle and starting up at that seed stage, you're going to be facilitating a lot, right? Like, don't ever rely on organic growth until organic growth shows up. And until it shows up, you need to be, if you're hosting an online forum or group or message board, you need to be in there, like prompting discussions, facilitating connections. If someone asks a question, you need to be tagging 3 people who might answer that question and are experts in that topic. So you want to be facilitating as much as possible until you reach that growth stage where it's starting to happen more organically. And so, at that point, maybe it moves to like 50% your time, 50% you are facilitating discussions, and 50% are happening organically in the community. And then as you move to further growth stages and ultimately to maturity, it's going to end up being like 99% of the activity is all organic, driven by the community. And you're just there to moderate and facilitate and nudge and kind of manage some of the rituals. And you've distributed authority to moderators and leaders within the community. So it's going to start off with like you doing 90% of the facilitation, move to like 50%, and then ultimately be like a very small amount of facilitation that you're doing.
So marketing has been around forever, but there's also now the rise of the chief customer officer, the chief experience officer. There's maturity around customer success. Are there any particular groups or professional leaders in those that I just mentioned that are trying to take the lead with the communities?
I mean, we're seeing that. I mean, when you see a chief customer officer, it's kind of used interchangeably with community. Like they could just as easily be called a chief community officer, because essentially what they're doing is saying like, all right, how do we make our business very like people focused? And I don't know. I mean, if you think about it, it's just like a nicer way of saying chief marketing officer or, chief product officer, which sounds very business centric. It's like about us, like we are marketing to you, or we're building a product we want you to buy. Whereas like chief customer officer is like, it's about you. And while that might be like a subtle shift in terminology, I think that's a pretty massive shift in mindset for companies to have. And, I think it's essentially like a people first or community first culture or value that companies are leading with. So I think that's all part of the same trend, and the language is used relatively interchangeably.
Speaking of trends, I know CMX just finished up a survey on the state of communities. Are there any macro trends you want to share with us?
Yeah, so we did a survey on essentially how events are evolving during coronavirus and how community teams are shifting their strategy when it comes to events. So, I mean, I don't know that there was anything massively surprising, but it was reaffirming to see how these teams are thinking about their strategy and how it's changing. A few of the key insights: we're not going to see conferences in person for a while, at least 6 to 12 months, but probably longer. They're just not planning on bringing that back anytime soon. I think if the world changes, if we find a vaccine, maybe that comes back a little faster, but I would say at least 2022 before we see big conferences being hosted again. Wow. They're looking more to bring back smaller local events sooner than later. And they're from what we've seen, they're looking at that on a case-by-case basis. So, if you have local events going in 100 cities around the world, they're not saying, okay, everyone start meeting up in person again. They're looking at it like, if your region is safe and your government policies allow for it, we trust you to decide if you should start gathering in person or not. We're also seeing that everyone's planning on essentially having a hybrid approach to community events in the future. So everyone's kind of shifted to virtual now. The data shows that like pretty much everyone just pivoted to virtual in this situation. Some people just canceled events altogether, but for the most part, everyone's doing virtual now. And they don't expect that to go away once the world opens up again. They expect it to be a hybrid, which means they'll be hosting both virtual events and in-person events, as well as events that themselves are hybrid. So you might have a live speaker and audience, but also be live streaming and have a virtual experience that now becomes accessible to your community all over the world. So yeah, it's still a lot kind of to be determined, but everyone's kind of just put in-person on pause, fully shifted to virtual, and virtual is here to stay. So if you're planning your long-term kind of event plans, I would look to think about how do you incorporate in-person and virtual rather than just choosing one.
I agree with you. Virtual's here to stay. I think it is a hybrid approach for certainly the big conferences, but can it be a hybrid approach for smaller conferences?
Yeah, I mean, why not, right? Like some of the best virtual events are small as well, right? It's broken out into small discussion groups where you actually get to talk to people and meet people and have conversations. So, there's no limit to how big a virtual event can be. So even if you had, 10 people there in person, but you have a great speaker and 1,000 people want to tune in online and then like go into 100 different breakout groups and talk to each other, or if it's 1,000 people, yeah, you could do 100 different breakout groups. Then like that's very doable for a company. And I mean, that's what everyone's learning now. I think everyone was kind of sleeping on virtual events before. What we've learned from this is that they don't replace in person, but they bring a whole lot of unique value as well. You can scale events in a way that you can't in person. There's no limit to stage space. You don't have to pay for people's sandwiches. And it's much more accessible to people all over the world. Most of these events are free now, so it's not price prohibitive for people. And so companies are learning how to do virtual events really well, and the tools are getting a lot smarter very, very quickly. And so whereas before, if you're hosting a local meetup, a company may have been intimidated by like, I don't know, how do we like live stream this? And how do we manage the conversations online? Like what tools will I even use? Like it was just overwhelming and didn't seem like a worthwhile endeavor in the past. Now everyone's gonna be super savvy at doing virtual events, and it won't feel as heavy of a lift to do on the side of your in-person events.
So you convinced me. I want to do a bunch of virtual events. I want to tie that into a community, but I don't have one yet. Where do I start? There's a bazillion and one vendors out there. Where does one begin?
Well, obviously you should use Bevy as your virtual event provider.
Or Influitive.
Exactly.
I guess
either one of us. So yeah, I mean, there's tons of tools, and everyone has a unique approach. Like, where we really specialize are in those distributed event programs where you have local chapter leaders organizing those events. I've seen like really innovative tools coming out that are trying to like innovate on space and time that make it feel more realistic. So like you would actually move around a map, and as you get closer to another person, their video and audio gets sharper, and then as you move away, it fades out.
Very
So
neat.
it actually feels more like serendipity. I tweeted the other day that like the event platform that figures out serendipity will win. So I think there's a lot of really creative stuff there. I can't share that one yet because it's in private beta, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. But don't overwhelm yourself. Like, don't try to find the perfect tool. Like, feel free to experiment and try different things. Go back to first principles. I think like where a lot of companies run into trouble with pivoting to virtual events is they try to say like, well, we had this great in-person event. How do we do that same thing online? And I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because you're not going to be able to. The right way to do it is say like, what was the purpose of that event? Like, why was that valuable? Like, why did we host it? And if we were to build this event as a virtual event from the ground up, what would that look like? So you're not trying to take your discussion groups and bring it online. Exactly. You're saying like, what would discussion groups look like if we were to start today online? And you don't have to start big. You don't need to have a 3,000 person event. You can start organizing, quick Zoom calls with 10 of your core customers and just start having those conversations and get used to facilitating discussions. Like I said, sometimes those smaller events are a lot more valuable than the really, really large conferences. So just start small, start experimenting, and you'll figure out kind of like the virtual event market fit for your customers and what really resonates with them.
Well, great. If you, it's a lot of great insight. And I guess if anyone in the audience wants to learn more and explore more, you've got an event virtually coming up in October timeframe that we are a sponsor of. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah. So I mean, we have tons and tons of content on community at cmxhub.com. And CMX Summit's going to be October 5th through 7th. It's free to register for the 6th and 7th, or we have an all access pass. That'll get you workshops on the 5th and lots of other benefits. And we're going to have like over 70 speakers, multiple stages, speed networking, some really fun, like just fun experiences that aren't just you listening to speakers, discussion groups. So yeah, please come see how we organize our event. We just did a 3,000 person conference online a few months ago. And so we learned a lot from that. And now we're bringing that to this event, which will be more than twice the size and have lots of great surprises there. So hope you'll join us.
Great.
And that's cmxhub.com/summit2020.
Great. I hope everyone can join. But if you have some burning questions now, you're more than welcome to post them in the discussion area below. David would be more than happy to answer those throughout the rest of the event. Enjoy the rest of the event. David, thank you much for your time.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
And now it's everyone's favorite question time. Let's get asking.